Record. We're recording. Paul, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm going to start in my usual way, which is with an introduction to everyone about who you are. So for those of you who are joining, this is Paul Freedman, professor of history at Yale. He served as the director of medieval studies, also was the chair of the history department, chair of program in the history of science and medicine at Yale, is also a prolific author, wrote one of my favorite books, The 10 Restaurants That Changed America, but also the author of Food, the History of Taste, Images of the Medieval Peasant, for which you actually won many awards, the Haskins Medal, the Otto Grunloh Prize, and the Eugene Caden Award for that particular book. Professor Freedman is a fellow of the Medieval Academy of America, member of the American Philosophical Society, and member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's such a pleasure to have you.
It's my pleasure, Casey. Yeah. Thank you so much. And so I am a medieval historian. That's my day job, or that's what I was hired to do. And the history of food is related, but is a second interest or passion of mine now.
And so I think it's important to let people know that you and I actually met in a restaurant. I worked at La Mercerie on the corner of Howard and Mercer. And when I saw Paul come in, became thrilled because I have my own curiosity, certainly not the degree of expertise that you have with the Middle Ages, but am deeply obsessed with how people ate and what people ate. And you wrote this beautiful book about restaurants that changed America. So I thought that the other thing that I typically do is just kind of let our viewers know the arc that we're going to follow. So we're going to talk about the Middle Ages, particularly the cuisine of the Middle Ages, with in mind kind of maybe finding some questions about what are the questions that we could ask ourselves about this contemporary and current landscape that we have that might help us, perhaps think of restaurants, but also cuisine and how we eat in different ways, because certainly restaurants have abruptly ended. So I would love for you to set the scene for us about, so of course, Middle Ages spans 1,000 years. So for the purposes of this talk, in some instances, we'll be talking in wildly general terms. But I thought you could set the scene of what it meant to eat in the Middle Ages, where and what the differences were based on where you were in society.
Sure. So in teaching, I'm responsible for a period that begins with the late Roman Empire, so the 4th century AD, up to 1500, the European arrival in America, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the conquest of the last remaining Islamic place in Spain, Granada. Those are the classic markers for the end of the Middle Ages. We have about 150 cookbooks that survive, beginning in the 13th century and increasing from the 13th to the 16th century, accounts of banquets and descriptions of other meals, and also accounts of what households bought, what kinds of supplies they bought, how much cinnamon they bought per month, things like that. So most of what I will say is for, let's say, 1200 to 1500.
Okay.
And one of the similarities between the Middle Ages and now is that people ate, as you said, differently depending on what their class was, what their access to what we would now call food security was, and what kinds of foods were show-off foods, what demonstrated that you had wealth and taste. The differences are great. Medieval prestige cuisine So what we would see at a banquet, not necessarily just of a prince or king, but of, say, a wealthy inhabitant of one of the prominent towns in northern Italy, or
Right.
Flanders, or Paris, for that matter. Their food would be foreign to much of what we think of
Oh,
luxury food now. Very colorful. They love different kinds of color combinations. Very ostentatious. Very processed in the sense that they don't lightly grill meat. They boil it, chop it up, put it into some kind of, breadcrumbs with mustard, fry it again, and serve it with a sauce. There's no point to having high class food that is simple. So
right.
no value placed on the purity of the product, the primary product.
Huh.
They're very protein oriented,
Right.
game, meat. The fish, because it's a Catholic fasting regime, at least 90 days a year, and in some cases, depending on how pious you were, 150 or really half the days of the year were days when you could not eat meat. So an awful lot of fish, and a lot of concern with health.
Right.
Is
And I just want
also
to go back to this fish thing because I read it in the paper that you sent was that so fasting was a little bit of there was a different understanding of fasting then than there is now. So because I was reading your description and a fasting meal for someone who's fasting in the Middle Ages is very different than the kind of contemporary European notions we have of fasting where it's no eating. The meal you describe is basically the same one as any other day of the week, except it's just heavy on fish. Is that correct?
exactly. So fasting does not mean eating less food or food. It means not eating meat or butter or certain other kinds of animal products.
Right.
But the coronation of Richard III, for example, in 1483, involved several days of banqueting, including one was a Friday. So Friday is a fast day in the Catholic tradition, or it was before the 1960s. And those meals include 35, 40 different kinds of fish.
Wow.
Exactly. Fasting does not represent abstemiousness, except that fish was considered to be inferior.
Huh.
Very few aristocrats would have fish if it was a meat day.
That's
And
interesting because it's a little bit different today. Fish is considered a little bit more or less common depending on where you are.
yes, it's a luxury food. And
Yeah.
then to certain fish, the herring was something that everybody ate and almost always salted and not fresh.
Right.
On the other hand, prestige adhered to fish like sturgeon,
Wow.
large, rare, a kind of eel-like creature that I imagine you are familiar with, lamprey,
Yep.
very popular in Bordeaux still.
Yep.
At one time, a horrible creature that lives by sucking out the guts of other fish, and it's horrible to kill it as well. It has to be bled. There's all sorts of gruesome ceremonies that you have to go through to prepare it, but it is delicious. I have had it once in Bordeaux. This was de rigueur in princely circles
Got
in
it.
the Middle East on fast days. But given their preference, they liked game. They liked lots of birds, very large ones like egrets or cranes, or
Right.
elaborate ones like peacocks, or very little ones like ortolans
Huh.
or larks or other tiny songbirds.
Huh.
They didn't have as much of a passion for beef as you might expect. They ate plenty of it, but more pork, more lamb, depending on the part of Europe. So
Was that kind of related to the agricultural practices? I mean, I assume that it would have been. Beef requires so much more land than the other animals? Or
You're rich, you could afford anything.
okay.
So I think it's just a preference. And then
Mhm.
finally, spices.
Yeah.
The popularity of spices was partly related to ideas of health. Spices, all edible spices were also regarded as drugs or preventive medicines.
Right.
But there's obviously a gastronomic preference for spicy food. Some of this seems to be inherited from the Roman Empire, which loved pepper in particular. Some of it comes from the Muslim world.
Hmm.
Uh, Sweet spices, adding sugar to spices, aromatic things like rose water,
Hmm.
dried fruit, almonds, all of these are taken from Islam. And it's worth remembering then as now, you often eat the food of your enemy. If your enemy is richer than you
Mm.
and has prestige products, you'll imitate it, even if you're launching military expeditions like the Crusades to try to drive them away.
Right. Yeah. And so they, right, which was, I mean, the Crusades were a big part of the Middle Ages in that there was this kind of like attempt to, dominate all of Islamic culture. Meanwhile, Islam and all Muslim countries were exhibiting kind of like superiority in the sciences and medicine and arts and food.
Items like clothes or armor or what's called damascene ware, which is a kind of inlaid metal combinations, perfumes. The Spanish Christian rulers built palaces and cathedrals using Muslim artisans. And
Yeah. Yeah.
these look like the Alhambra, or they look like mosques
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. Particularly in the southern part of Spain, especially the
Mediterranean
Yeah.
countries, exactly. So the health concerns, all food was thought to have properties related to what were called humors.
Mm.
So the humors are combinations, are bodily fluids that combine qualities like heat, cold, moist, and dry.
Right.
And the ideal meal would be a balance of these ingredients. So to get back to lamprey, for example, lamprey was delicious but dangerous. It was considered very cold and very wet.
Right.
And in order to offset that, it was best to make it with a lot of pepper, because pepper is hot and dry.
Right. Okay.
So
It
there's a
reminds
lot of
me a little bit of kind of like speaking of kind of all, because we're talking about Europe in many instances, right? But it's like we get to think about the 5 elemental acupuncture, which is what these different humors of European Middle Ages makes me think of. It's like 5 element acupuncture focuses on wet, wind, wood, heat, also water, and the idea is to be able to hold all of those in balance. And so that's interesting that there was this notion as well in kind of prestige food during the Middle Ages.
I think the key word is balance.
Yeah.
So a lot of civilizations, China, the Greek medicine that the Middle Ages inherits, Ayurvedic medicine in India,
Yeah.
all strive for a kind of equilibrium.
And so there's this health component. They are obsessed with, game, meat. And again, we're talking about the more wealthy and courtly spaces. What is happening kind of with with folks who are not nobility, who are servants to the noble class in a way?
Well, I think the servants get to eat the leftovers that the nobles in their ostentatious meals leave. So I would say there's probably less food waste on the part of the wealthy than now, because the servants would eat the food that was left over. They'd give away a lot of it to the poor. There were plenty of friends and family of the servants waiting at the back door of the castle or the palace. So I don't think a whole lot of food went to waste, but the overwhelming majority of the population were peasants
Yeah,
whose surplus fed the clergy, the nobles, and for that matter, the university professors.
that's right.
So uh, I'd say the key thing is that the peasants ate better than most people would think. That's not to say that there weren't frequent shortages of food related to drought or excessive rain or supply problems, but the average peasant probably had a more, from the modern point of view, balanced diet than did the aristocracy. They actually ate vegetables, which the wealthy despised. They ate dairy products, which the wealthy only selectively considered worth eating. They had a meat flavored, vegetable forward diet without knowing that that's what they were eating. Uh, they ate an awful lot of carbohydrates, wheat if they could get it, more often grains like barley or millet or rye.
Right.
Uh, we tend to think that they're always on the edge of starvation and that they never see meat. They never see anything other than maybe an onion or a piece of garlic. That's actually that's actually not true. That's not to say that their lives weren't constrained by the lords who exploited them, and it's not to deny that all sorts of disease, famine stalked cities as well as the countryside. But the average peasant in an average year had a fair number of resources in terms of variety of food that was pretty well balanced compared to the ostentatious food of the wealthy.
And was that set of resources in part because of their proximity to the sources of food?
Definitely.
Okay.
So to some extent, they are, as I said, constrained by their lords. They might not be allowed to fish in certain streams or get products out of the forest. They were supposed to render a proportion of their crop. It might be 1/4 of all the wheat that they produced, or they owed labor services to the Lord on his land. They had to harvest his wheat. But because they're the ones on the scene, they often are able to harvest more for themselves than officially they were supposed to. They're able to engage in what the lords considered poaching, that is, illegal trapping of animals or fishing. They also had gardens that escape the notice or record keeping of the lords, which is what we tend to rely on.
Huh.
Uh, and they they brewed ale, they had dairy cattle, they made cheese and other byproducts of milk. Again, I don't want to make it seem as if this was some sort of homestead
Yeah,
idle.
no, that's right. I mean, there was the terrible suffering, but I guess that was my question around kind of like, was this ability to have the resources in part because of simply the proximity, because they were the ones kind of in this position of being the ones who were making the product. And, you know,
Definitely.
yeah. And so so I want us to kind of get a little bit more focused on, because we're, you know, by nature of the kind of like the wideness of the subject matter, I want us to focus on kind of, because we're going to be talking about restaurants, and restaurants imply the ability to be able to render money for services. And some of the restaurants that you and I that I work in and that you've written about are restaurants that are, you know, phenomenally expensive, but that are kind of organized in different ways. So, you know, Chez Panis is one of them, and then La Mercerie is another one. You know, in Spain they're organized. So my question is, going back to the Middle Ages, who who cooked the meals, like who, and then what And then what happened? Like, how were they brought to the hall or in? So who cooked them, and then how were they delivered?
So it depends on the setting. There are no restaurants in the Middle Ages.
No.
We define restaurant as a place where you have not just you can eat outside your home, but a place where you have like a menu, you come with friends and you sit with them. It's open a fair number of hours a day. That doesn't exist until Paris, 1770 at the
Right.
earliest. What they have in the Middle Ages are inns, which provide some kind of meal, but you don't have much choice of
No,
time or menu.
that's right.
They have taverns, which provide snacks to keep you drinking. They have a lot of takeout. So like if you go to the weekly market, there will be people with portable pie ovens. So they've got the equivalent of food trucks, and pies are ideal because you can sort of take them away with your hands. They can be
Wow.
eaten hot or cold, and they're not that expensive to prepare. But the food for the well-off, and again, I'm including not just princes, but the bourgeois
Sure.
class, would be prepared by a chef. And in the aristocratic households, the chef was almost like a military commander, an organizer.
That's
Labor
not so different as it is.
not so different. The difference is that the labor was cheap, so that you could have two kids, usually children or very young adults, in charge of just turning the spit and making
Right.
sure that roasted meat was evenly cooked. You had all sorts of personnel chopping, grinding, preparing, and cooking food. The food would be brought to the hall where the diners were. It's hard to imagine it being very hot. It was served, depending again on your status, according to a very formal set of rules. So, for example, there's a 15th century book in English called the Book of Carving, and it is instructions on how to carve 40 different kinds of things.
Mm.
And you even are supposed to use a different verb of action for different kinds of carving. So you're supposed to, I can't remember exactly, but it's like barb a lobster, but despoil a swan,
Right.
and flay a sturgeon.
Mm,
So
mm.
each meat or fish has its own procedure.
Mm.
Crab is the hardest.
Right.
The author of the Book of Carving says crab is, uses the medieval equivalent to a pain in the ass, because once you finally carve it, it's cold and has to be sent back for reheating.
Right.
But the carver then was a skilled servant, and then the company would be served. Often the table of the ruler or of the bishop or of the elite host would get more food and finer food than the other tables. So you might have a routine meal in which the count got 5 dishes and everybody at his table got 5 dishes, but the people at the table of, say, the town's people, the merchant elite, got 3 dishes.
Right. Can we just take a moment because I've actually learned how to share my screen, and can you tell us a little bit about these dishes right here? So like this one?
Yes, so remember what I said about ostentation. They
Yeah.
love they love Las Vegas kind of presentations. So this is a boar's head, which was a common dish until the 19th century, particularly in Britain associated with Christmas.
Right.
It's covered, the part that, and you can see its hoof served as well. So it's covered with a kind of parsley sauce, green. On the other side is edible gold leaf. You can only just see its
Whoa.
edge. And it's breathing fire. They love things breathing fire. The way they do that is they hold the mouth open with little stakes, and they've got a camphor wick, camphor soaked wick. Camphor, very, very expensive. It had to come from what's now Malaysia and Indonesia. It's a kind of resin, but it's flammable. And so you would soak a wick in liquid camphor and bring a wooden stick to it and set it on fire. Then it's brought in to the banquet hall, breathing fire.
That is just wild. So
And this is a routine dish. I mean, it's in lots and lots of cookbooks. It's not something that only appeared once or twice in the Middle Ages.
It's just kind of common. I mean, common to a certain class of people.
It would be like beef Wellington in the 1970s.
Okay. So I have a question around the structure of the kitchen. Is this where is a chef? So I guess my question is rooted in one of the things that I read of yours about this kind of like this knowledge of spices and this knowledge of cuisine, but particularly spices is a point of pride. So do these kind of this bourgeoisie and or nobility and kings and queens as we go higher up in society, are they knowledgeable in what they are eating, or is there an element of surprise that's happening?
That's a interesting question to me, because on the one hand, they have to be knowledgeable and they show off just the way the restaurant patrons know now the difference between different kinds of wines, or
Right.
they understand that spaghetti and meatballs is not authentically Italian.
Right.
Or the names of different pastas. And as a restaurant patron, I have found, and as somebody who considers himself well-informed, every menu that at a fairly high-end restaurant I've been to has something I don't know what it is.
Yeah, right. I mean, it almost is like the challenge of the restaurant to create something that is going to elicit that question, and or the services of the server in providing the initial service, which is a guide through the menu.
Exactly. So, but on the other hand, ostentation and impressing people depends on a certain number of agreed upon things. So in late 19th, early 20th century feasting, you sort of have to have pâté de foie gras.
Oui.
You have to have caviar.
Right.
In the United States in the 19th century, you had to have wild canvasback ducks, or saddle of lamb, or some luxury preparation of oysters,
right.
or terrapin, turtles.
Right.
So if you look at the banquets, it looks as if they're having the same thing all the time. So there's a mixture of expected luxury products.
Right, okay.
And then surprise, but the surprise is more on the presentation than on the ingredients.
Right.
And because of the variety of species that people are eating,
right.
They have much greater access to wild food than we do. They haven't depleted the environment to the degree that we have. And you couldn't put together 40 different fish easily in a restaurant now. Well, and you'd have to go to some special.
It would almost be looked down upon because
it wouldn't be sustainable.
No, yeah, it wouldn't be sustainable.
Nobody worries about this in the Middle Ages. I mean, they do have an impact on the environment. Certain kinds of things were always uncommon. But, you know, if France had a population of 4 million, that's
yeah, that's nothing.
That's not as big a burden on nature as obviously currently.
And so my last question, and then I wonder if we could kind of well, I have two more questions, but so the other one is about the structure of the kitchen. Is being a chef well regarded, and is it something that folks would apprentice and then become? And are chefs a part of the court in the same way, even though lowly knights are?
Well, chefs have prestige, and you do apprentice. So it's a craft, and
Okay.
it's an appreciated craft. In the Middle Ages, certain crafts like goldsmithing were more prestigious than other ones like leather tanning or innkeeping. So that the most famous chef of the Middle Ages is a man whose nickname was Taillevent. Taillevent is also a famous restaurant in Paris,
Yeah.
named after this 14th century chef. And he was so famous, he cooked for several kings of France, that he was knighted and given a coat of arms.
Got
And
it.
he's buried in Lorraine in armor, with a sword, with his first and second wife by his side. His first wife died.
Right.
There's even a little dog at their feet, which is the way aristocratic tomb sculptures look. But his coat of arms was 3 cooking pots. So there's a certain, let's say, patronizing, indulgent, and lightly contemptuous attitude towards it. He's proud.
Right.
He has his tomb sculpture showing his coat of arms, but that is unusual. There are celebrity chefs then, but unlike now, they're not artists, creators of things that no one has ever seen before.
Okay.
Andrea or Rene Redzepi,
Right.
or David Chang. They're it's like the best goldsmith in Bruges,
Got it.
or the best leather worker in Florence.
Got it. And so, can you tell us a little bit about what happens at the kind of end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the kind of the 15th, 16th century that demarcates that as a different era, and what are not only kind of like the events that demarcate those eras, but is there anything or any particular change in how people eat that signifies also that, you know, the historical decision that we've made to distinguish this is the end of this era and this is the beginning of a new one?
Well, food is kind of a lagging indicator, as is music, which I know interests you.
Mm.
So Renaissance music is different from the Middle Ages, but not very. Not
No.
to the degree that classical music of the 18th century
Right.
is unrecognizable to the Renaissance, and really vice versa. So the food of the Renaissance, so the 16th century, for example, is similar to the Middle Ages. Ostentation, spices, variety. It becomes different because Protestant countries no longer practice the same kind of fasting. But the real break and the invention of what has been modern food is the 17th and 18th century in France. The French reject spices. They exalt the purity of ingredients. A famous author of a cookbook in the mid 17th century says a cabbage should taste like a cabbage.
Right.
The idea is that sauces should enhance, not cover up flavor. They shouldn't be the primary flavor. So that sauces will be made, for example, to intensify. Made out of a sauce for beef will be made out of beef drippings. It is flavored down with things like herbs, shallots, truffles, not with cinnamon or sugar as in the Middle Ages.
Right.
So the French define high-end cuisine for at least 250 years, really only waning in the 1980s with the entry of competitors like Japan and Italy, and later kind of a free-for-all in the 21st century.
Totally.
But the French contribution was not only to have a dossier of accepted dishes, but to really change European food so that, for example, spices like cinnamon or cloves or nutmeg would be exiled to desserts.
Right.
You wouldn't sprinkle, and in the Renaissance, a pasta would be served often with Parmesan cheese, as it is now, but also with cinnamon and sugar.
Cinnamon. That's right.
Which nobody does now.
Right.
So the real break is what was called Nouvelle Cuisine of the 17th and 18th century, a new aesthetic. Of course, it gets very elaborate. Those sauces that were
Yeah,
originally meant
totally. Then they go out
there
of
become
control.
hundreds of them. But there are periodic efforts at reform, of which the Nouvelle Cuisine of the 1970s in France was one. It
Right.
rejected heavy sauces, it lightened up on butter, it absorbed a few little Japanese presentation aesthetics, it used things like vanilla, it mixed things up a bit, but it was, in a sense, simply the continuation of you reform things, then you let them get more complicated, and then you reform them again.
Right. And so I mean, maybe you could give us, because I know this is, I mean, you wrote this beautiful book about it, but let's just go from, so we're in France, 17th, 18th century. I understand, so I grew up in France, born and raised in the south of France, and we always knew and understood kind of our servers, les garçons, les serveurs, tout ça. They were professions, they were paid, and it was only when I came to the United States when I was 18, so in the 1990s, that there was this notion of pourboire, that you gave a tip, right? And then once I kind of came into restaurants and grew up in restaurants in the United States, the way restaurants are organized, certainly for service, is exclusively around a tipping system. In France, not so much. But I want to go from France, we're here, then move to the United States specifically. And you wrote this book about, 10 restaurants that changed how America eats. So what is as you see it up until maybe, a couple of months ago, what was the landscape of American cuisine in restaurants? Let's just move specifically to restaurants.
So those 10 restaurants, 4 were French or started out as French.
Yeah.
Delmonico's, the first first real restaurant in the United States, described itself as a French restaurant. Le Pavillon was the leading restaurant in the United States in the mid-20th century. It was also French. Antoine's in New Orleans now describes itself as haute Creole, but for the longest time, its menu was only in French, without English.
Proudly so. I mean, if you couldn't read it, you were on your own. Like that was.
Well, they wanted the customer to ask the waiter's advice.
Right.
The server would instruct them, because otherwise, the owner once said, otherwise I'll just order T-bone steak and French fries, and we want them actually to appreciate the bœuf Robespierre or the oui très bien ville. So a lot of American food grew up imitating France. As you say, the atmosphere of restaurants is different, both because of discretionary tipping in the United States, and also, until recently, most servers were not professional. It was a job for people who needed a source of income while they tried to break into acting or something else,
right,
or restaurant management. So the European had a certain craft skill and prestige and long tenure. That existed in the United States, but it was not so common. So, for example, Agent Tallner, a restaurant in Brooklyn that unfortunately was supposed to reopen about a month ago. In its old incarnation, most of the servers were African American, and they had been there for decades.
Right.
The American restaurant patron of recent years has become somebody who is more eclectic than the people you grew up with. Mm-hmm. In other words, presumably in the south of France and even in Paris some time ago, people didn't regularly decide to go to a Thai restaurant one night and to a Moroccan restaurant the next night. They might go to an Alsatian restaurant one night and restaurant the next. But this kind of eclecticism is the mark of America, and it goes back to the late 19th century, when Chinese and Italian restaurants particularly, and to some extent in the West, Mexican restaurants, became patronized by people who weren't Chinese,
Right.
Italian, or Mexican.
Yeah. So, you and I could go on forever, but
Indeed.
and I guess I have two last questions. I love restaurants. They brought me up. They grew me up. I have strong and close friendships with chefs and servers and bartenders and managers who taught me how to be a manager, and have felt deep concern with my restaurant life has been almost exclusively in the United States, and even more exclusively in New York City. So it's a very particular restaurant experience that I have, one that involves, Michelin star chefs and Michelin star restaurants. So with that kind of like professionalism of a restaurant career, but with what has happened with coronavirus and the sudden and immediate closure of the restaurants, I've become and always was deeply concerned with how sustainable they were, not only in their structure, but in, how we dealt with food and food excess and food wastes. And so it was really interesting for me to hear that in the Middle Ages, at the time of great feasts, at the end of the feast, everyone got to take food home, more or less. But one of the things that we struggle with as restaurants in New York City, even if we want to donate the food at the end of the evening, food that we can't refrigerate and can't carry over to the next day, it is almost impossible to do it because of the kind of bylaws that now, out of necessity and correctly to a certain degree, keep us from being able to do that because of hygiene. And so
Yeah.
I wonder if, as a historian, you have some insight into what are the things we can consider and wonder about. I mean, I always, I joked about this before I started recording, that like perhaps the French in me is much more interested in the questions we might have rather than any sort of answers to the problem that lies ahead. But an entire industry has basically collapsed, and the large portion of unemployment that we're seeing is the restaurant industry. And so I wonder if there's anything in particular that you can think of from a historical standpoint that we might want to look at as we move forward in thinking about what restaurants might look like and could look like and should look like.
Well, it's a good thing that you like questions rather than answers, because I don't want to claim expertise in the restaurant business model and its survivability, nor do I have any expertise in how long the virus is going to run and how people will feel once it's more or less over. And I think you know probably more about that than I do. I guess I would say that with regard to New York in particular, there are issues of crowding. In other words, you can say, oh, well, restaurants will just have to have more space between tables. Maybe they'll fill every other table. And that's possible in some places. But New York is already, before the virus, packed. Restaurants were barely getting by.
Right.
So it's disingenuous to say that, you just, keep 6 feet apart from the next table.
Right. I mean, some of my favorite restaurants had 12 tables in them, and they were a little...
Right, so that they go to 6 tables.
Yeah.
And a lot has to do with people's reactions. On the one hand, a lot of people there'll be pent-up demand. They'll be so eager to go to their favorite restaurant, so delighted to discover that it's survived. But a lot of the elderly clientele, particularly, are going to be maybe less enthusiastic. And for the younger clientele, who's going to have money?
Right.
What is the impact on the economy going to be? Restaurants are something that people can do without. What's going to happen to delivery? That is, a high-end restaurant really can't make it on a delivery model in normal times. You can't charge $75 a person for something that people pick up at the door, and you can't make any money on that. So I'm not incredibly optimistic because, as you said, so many of them were just getting by as it is. I think somebody is going to come along and open up restaurants, but it may not be the same people who had restaurants going in January
Right.
of this year. In terms of historical precedents, there have been plagues and diseases all the time, certainly in the developed world as well as the undeveloped world, until the 20th century. The last great epidemic was the 1918 flu.
Right.
But the world was less closely integrated, and the public health measures were more inept or ineffective. So this is certainly the first time we've seen this kind of shutdown. The parallel that occurs to me is not, as some people have said, 9/11, which, although a terrible event and a tremendous emergency, people's response to 9/11 often was to patronize restaurants, to sort of show their solidarity. And it's not really the Depression or the recession of 2008. I think it's prohibition. Prohibition from 1920 to 1933, the prohibition of alcoholic beverages wrecked the restaurant model of the high-end restaurant. So a high-end restaurant served French food, which was what the high-end restaurants were, couldn't get by without serving wine for two reasons. One is a French meal without wine is sort of pointless.
Not a meal.
Not a meal. And secondly, the restaurants then and now make a lot of money off of alcohol. That has a higher profit margin than the food.
It's the highest. It's the highest. Food is actually the lowest in some cases. Not.
That's why portions can be so large, because that's not where the expense is. So the full service, elegant French restaurant almost ceased to exist in the 1920s. That didn't mean that restaurants as a whole did not flourish. It's just that lower end restaurants, things like coffee shops or luncheonettes, as they were called, drugstores used to have soda fountains. All of this category, and then soon after, by the 1930s, highway food. All of these flourished, but it's depressing because the fine food model is so hard to restore once it's been damaged.
Yeah. So I feel like this is a thoughtful place to end. I've asked everyone to consider one last question, and the question is more related kind of very specifically to what's happening now. Is there a particular change in perspective that you've had, either related to your study? You're also a professor at Yale. You've had your entire institution closed before the end of the year. Is there any particular change in perspective that has occurred to you that is new? Mine has been, I have been astounded with how deeply I reconnected to my commitment to be close to food sources, and something I always knew about, but I'm deeply humbled by the environment that in some urban settings that a lot of my friends don't have access to, where food comes from outside of a supermarket. So that has been one of mine that is related to our conversation. And I wonder if there's one in particular that has happened to you that you would be open to.
So I'd say for me, it's not so much food related, although I've been doing a lot of cooking,
Yeah.
and that has both
Yeah.
honed my skills and made me all the more miss dining out. But I'm lucky in that my wife and I have not suffered the virus. We live in a house that is somewhat too large for us, and the conditions we have are privileged in this context. So I'm aware that what I'm going to say sounds a bit self-indulgent, but it's an honest answer to your question. What I have discovered is that the busyness, travel, deadlines, and other noise of my existence is not only dispensable, but that on some level, the tranquility, the ability to concentrate is something that I hope will stay with me as a sense of priorities and of personal insight.
Mm, mm.
My cat, for a while, wondered what we were doing at home
You
all
guys
the
are
time. So I'm not sure what it's going to be like if and when we're out of the house all day. But
yeah.
I also acknowledge that that is a self-indulgent and rather particular preoccupation.
Yeah, I think everyone's has been though, and it's been they have interestingly actually all been related and have had to do with one's new acquaintance with time.
Very much so.
Yeah, so not as particular as you. The details might be different, but the through line is the same. So, Paul, thank you so much for your time. It's just been such a pleasure. I'm gonna stop recording, and then you and I will be able to say a proper goodbye.
Okay, Casey.
All right. Let's see.